The demolition crew found it on a Tuesday morning in March 2003, buried beneath the rotted floorboards of what had once been a bunkhouse. The foreman's sledgehammer broke through the wood with a crack that echoed across the empty Texas scrubland, and there in the dust and debris sat a rusted tin box, no bigger than a man's hand. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, lay a harmonica, German-made pre-war craftsmanship, the kind they stopped making after 1945. Engraved on the side in small, careful letters, W.R. Freiburg, 1944. The foreman turned it over in his calloused hands, squinting at the inscription. The Mesquite Springs Ranch had been empty for 8 years, sold to developers who planned to pave over 12,000 acres of history for a shopping center and subdivision. But this harmonica, this small piece of metal and memory, stopped the demolition cold. He called the Historical Society that afternoon. They opened a file, started making inquiries. And slowly, piece by piece, a story emerged that had been buried for nearly 60 years. A story about 17 boys who crossed an ocean as enemies and left as something else entirely. But that story begins earlier on a day when the Texas sun beat down just as merciless, and a truck carrying prisoners of war rolled through a ranch gate that might as well have been the edge of the world. July 14th, 1944. The truck bed was metal, and it held heat like a skillet. 17 boys sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, hands gripping the rails as the vehicle bounced over ruts in the dirt road. The youngest was 14. The oldest had just turned 16. Their uniforms hung loose on frames that averaged 89 pounds, and their hands bore blisters from 6 months in Hitler youth training camps where they'd learned to march in formation and sing songs about destiny and blood. None of them had fired a weapon in combat. Most had surrendered in France without a single shot, overwhelmed by forces they'd been told would crumble at the sight of German steel. Now they were 4,000 miles from home, crossing a landscape so vast and empty it made their hearts sink with a loneliness deeper than any they'd known. Dietrich Albrecht sat near the back, 15 years old, jaw clenched tight against the fear that threatened to crack his composure. The other boys had looked to him since the training camps, because he carried himself like someone who knew what to do, even when he didn't. His father had been like that. Gunther Albrecht, factory foreman in Hamburg, the kind of man who could walk into a room and calm it with his presence. The Royal Air Force had killed him in February of 43. The bombs had come at night, and Dietrich had been staying with his aunt across the city. He'd seen the fires from her window, orange and red consuming the skyline. When he returned the next morning, there was nothing left but rubble and a silence so complete it rang in his ears. That silence lived in him still as the truck rolled toward whatever fate awaited them in Texas. Across from him sat Wolfgang Richter, 16, with dark hair and eyes that saw too much. Everyone called him Wolf. He kept one hand pressed against his boot, feeling for the small bulge where he'd hidden his harmonica, the one thing he'd managed to keep through capture and transport and the endless processing that had stripped them of everything else. His hometown of Freiburg was gone, reduced to broken stone and memories. The harmonica was all he had left of before. Beside Wolf, Klaus Brenner stared at his hands. 14 years old, 76 pounds, the smallest of them all. His mother's letters had arrived regularly until November, then stopped. No explanation, just silence where her words used to be. He told himself she was fine, just busy, but the fear lived in his stomach like cold water. The truck turned off the main road onto a dirt track that stretched between fence posts strung with barbed wire. Mesquite trees dotted the landscape, their branches twisted and reaching like arthritic fingers. Cattle grazed in loose herds, and in the distance buildings shimmered in the heat haze. A barn, a main house, corrals made of weathered wood. The propaganda had been specific. American cowboys were lawless killers, descendants of criminals and degenerates who'd fled civilized Europe. They tortured prisoners, dragged them behind horses until there was nothing left but bone and blood. The instructors at the training camp had shown drawings described atrocities in detail, designed to harden the boys for what they'd face if captured. Dietrich had believed it all. Why wouldn't he? Everything else they'd been told about the war had proven true. Germany was strong. Germany was destined. Germany would reshape the world. Except Germany had lost France. And now 17 boys who should have been in school sat in a truck bed rolling toward a ranch where men with ropes waited. The truck stopped in a cloud of dust. The engine cut off, and in the sudden silence, Dietrich could hear his own heartbeat, quick and rabbit-fast, in his chest. "Raus," the American guard said. "Out." His German was terrible, but the meaning clear. They climbed down one by one, legs stiff from the ride hands shaking despite their best efforts to appear strong. The sun hit them like a physical force. This was a different heat than Europe, dry and relentless, sucking moisture from the air and leaving everything brittle. A man stood waiting by the barn. He was old, maybe 63 or 65, with a face weathered brown as saddle leather and legs bowed from decades on horseback. His shirt was faded blue work cotton, tucked into jeans, held up by a belt with a silver buckle. He wore a hat with a wide brim that shaded his eyes, and when he moved, it was with the careful economy of someone whose body had learned to conserve energy in the heat. He didn't speak at first, just looked at them one by one, taking measure. His eyes were pale blue, the colour of winter sky, and they held no rage, no hatred, just a flat assessment that somehow felt worse than anger. The boys waited. Dietrich's hands curled into fists at his sides. He thought about his father, about how Gunther would have stood here, shoulders back, chin up, refusing to show weakness, even in the face of death. The old man stepped forward. One of the boys flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, the man nodded toward the barn and said one word in English that needed no translation by context and tone: work. That was all. No threats, no ropes, no violence, just work. The guard who'd driven them translated properly into German, but by then the meaning had already settled over the 17 boys like a blanket, smothering their fear with confusion. The old man turned and walked toward the barn, bow-legged stride kicking up small clouds of dust. After a moment the boys followed, because what else could they do? The ranch foreman's name was Russell Kowalski, though everyone called him Rusty, for reasons that had less to do with the colour of his hair, now gone mostly grey, and more to do with 40 years of nicknames sticking to a man like rust to iron. He'd been born in Poland in 1881, had left at age 12 when his father died, and his mother couldn't feed 5 children on what she could earn cleaning houses. He'd arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on his back and a steel determination to never be hungry again. Texas had been random, just where the work was when he needed it, but the land had claimed him. The first time he'd sat a horse and felt the animal respond to pressure from his knees, the first time he'd worked cattle across open range with nothing but skill and rope, he'd known he'd found what his soul was built for. 40 years. 40 years of sun and dust, and the kind of work that wore a man down to his essential elements, stripped away everything false until what remained was pure and tested. He'd judged men his whole life, good hands from bad, workers from shirkers, those who'd stick when things got hard, and those who'd fold at the first sign of trouble. He judged by what a man did not, what he said, by the blisters on his hands and the steadiness of his gaze. These boys were terrified. He could see it in the way they held themselves rigid as fence posts, trying not to shake. They expected brutality, had been taught to expect it. He'd been taught things too back in Poland, that Jews were different, that gypsies stole children, that the world was divided into kinds of people, some better than others. Texas had burned those lessons out of him, one day at a time, one shared meal and hard ride and campfire story at a time. The West didn't care where you came from, it cared whether you could do the work. These boys could learn, or they couldn't. Either way, Rusty would know within a week. The bunkhouse was simple. Wooden walls, a dozen narrow beds with thin mattresses, a stove for heat in winter, though it wouldn't be needed now. The windows had screens but no glass, and the breeze that came through smelled like dust and cattle and dried grass. The boys filed in, each choosing a bed with the careful deliberation of people trying to make a decision that might matter later in ways they couldn't predict. Dietrich took one near the door. Wolf chose the corner. Klaus ended up in the middle, surrounded by others, which seemed to calm something in him. An American cowboy appeared in the doorway, younger than Rusty, maybe 45, with dark hair and a moustache that covered his upper lip. He carried a box and set it down with a thump. "Clothes," he said in German, that was better than the guards but still heavily accented. "You change, keep uniforms folded, dinner in 1 hour." He left before anyone could respond. The box held work clothes, jeans stiff with newness, cotton shirts in various shades of blue and grey, belts. The boys changed in silence, each one acutely aware that they were shedding their identity with their uniforms, putting on the costume of the enemy. The jeans didn't fit. They were sized for men, and these were boys. Dietrich had to cinch his belt tight to keep the waistband from sliding down his narrow hips. The shirt hung loose on his frame. He looked at himself, at the others, and saw how small they'd become. How young. Wolf tucked his harmonica into the pocket of his new jeans, felt it press against his thigh like a secret. Klaus rolled up his pant legs because they were too long, and even then they bunched at his ankles. When the hour passed, they filed out toward the main building, following the smell of cooking that drifted across the ranch yard. Smoke rose from a chimney and light spilled from windows as the sun began its long descent toward the horizon. The dining hall was attached to the main house, a long room with tables set up cafeteria style. The cowboys were already there, 8 or 9 of them, sitting and talking in low voices that stopped when the German boys entered. Dietrich felt their eyes, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity, and something else he couldn't name. The boys clustered together at one end of a table, unsure whether they were supposed to sit or stand or wait for permission. Rusty appeared from the kitchen carrying a platter. He set it down on the table in front of the boys, then went back and returned with another, and another. Steaks, grilled over mesquite, still sizzling, each one as thick as Dietrich's thumb. Beans cooked with bacon and molasses, the kind that stuck to your ribs. Cornbread cut into squares, butter melting into the golden surface. Potatoes mashed with milk and salt. The boys stared. This was prisoner food. This was what the enemy ate when they were guarding captives who came from the supposed master race. Dietrich looked at the steak on his plate, at the juice pooling around it at the charred edges where the heat had sealed in the flavor. He thought about the rations at the training camp. Thin soup, black bread that sat heavy in the stomach, potatoes when they were lucky. This was more food than he'd seen on one plate in 2 years. Wolf's hands trembled as he picked up his fork. Klaus just stared, eyes wide. One of the cowboys, the one who'd brought the clothes, said something in English. The words were unclear, but the tone was casual, almost amused. Another cowboy laughed. They were just eating. Acting like this was normal. Like feeding the enemy better than they fed their own soldiers was the most natural thing in the world. Dietrich cut into his steak. The knife slid through with barely any resistance, and the meat inside was pink and tender. He lifted the bite to his mouth. Salt hit first, then the richness of the beef, the smoke from the mesquite, a sweetness that came from the char. Fat coated his tongue like silk, and the texture was so tender it barely needed chewing. He'd forgotten food could taste like this. Had forgotten there was anything beyond survival, eating, shoveling fuel into your body to keep it running. This was something else. This was abundance. This was a country so rich it could feed its prisoners like honored guests. Across the table, Wolf took a bite and closed his eyes. A sound escaped him, half moan, half sob, quickly stifled. Klaus ate slowly, mechanically, like he didn't trust that the food was real. The propaganda had said America was on the verge of starvation, that the people were weak and desperate, their factories failing, their soldiers starving in the field. But if this was starvation, what had Germany been eating? Dietrich thought about his mother in Hamburg, about the ration cards and the long lines for bread, about the thin soup they'd stretched to feed 4 people, about going to bed hungry more nights than not. And here he sat, eating steak thick as his fist, while his mother probably gnawed on turnips and told herself things would get better when the war was won. The guilt tasted worse than the food tasted good. He forced himself to eat anyway, because he was a prisoner, and prisoners ate what they were given, because his body needed it after months of near starvation, because refusing would insult the men who'd cooked it, and insulting your captors when you didn't know their intentions was foolish. But mostly because some small part of him, the part that was still just a boy and not a soldier, wanted to believe that maybe everything Berlin had taught him was wrong. The first morning came with roosters crowing and lights slanting through the bunkhouse windows at an angle that promised heat. Dietrich woke to the sound of boots on wooden floors and voices speaking English in tones that suggested this was routine, nothing special, just another day. The boys dressed quickly in their new work clothes and filed out to find breakfast already laid out in the dining hall. Eggs scrambled with cheese, bacon thick-cut and crispy, more cornbread, coffee black as motor oil. The bacon stopped Klaus mid-step. He'd never seen strips so thick, so perfectly cooked that the edges curled and the fat rendered to translucent amber. He took a piece, bit into it, and the world narrowed to that single sensation. The crack of the crispy edge breaking between his teeth. The give of the meat beneath yielding but substantial. Salt and smoke flooded his mouth first, then a sweetness he couldn't identify, something the Americans did with maple syrup, though he didn't know that yet. The fat coated his mouth, his throat warm and rich and impossibly decadent. He took another bite and another, eating faster than he should, unable to stop himself. Wolf watched him and understood completely. This wasn't just food. This was proof that everything they'd been told was a lie. They'd been taught that Germans were the superior race destined to rule because they were stronger, smarter, more disciplined than everyone else. They'd been taught that Americans were soft weak, corrupted by their mixed blood and democratic weakness. But how could the weak live like this? How could the inferior eat bacon as thick as a man's thumb, while the master race gnawed on bread crusts? The cognitive dissonance was physical, a pressure in Wolf's chest that made it hard to breathe. Every bite Klaus took was another crack in the foundation of everything Berlin had built in their minds. After breakfast, Rusty led them to the tack room. It was a shed attached to the barn, cool and dim, smelling of leather and oil and horse sweat accumulated over decades. Saddles hung on wooden racks along the walls, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. Bridles dangled from hooks. Blankets were folded on shelves with the precision of military supply. Rusty pointed to a pile on the floor and said something in English. The guard translated, "You learn to saddle horses. Start with carrying the equipment." He picked up a saddle to demonstrate hoisting it with practiced ease, despite his age, then set it back down and stepped aside. Dietrich moved first because he was the leader and leaders led. He bent, wrapped his arms around a saddle and tried to lift. 40 pounds of leather and metal and wood. His arms shook. His back screamed. He got it 6 inches off the ground before his grip failed and it thudded back down. His face burned with shame. The other boys watched. The cowboys watched. Even Rusty watched with those pale blue eyes that gave away nothing. Dietrich wanted to explain that he'd been sick, that he'd lost weight, that 6 months ago he could have done this easily. But explanations were just excuses, and excuses were weakness. He bent again, determined to try harder to force his body to obey through sheer will, the way the instructors had taught him. A shadow fell across him. Rusty had stepped closer, and for a moment Dietrich braced for the blow he'd been taught to expect, for the boot to the ribs or the backhand across the face that would teach him not to be weak. Instead, Rusty bent down, picked up the saddle with one hand like it weighed nothing, and set it against his hip. He shifted his weight, letting his legs take the load, keeping his back straight. He held it there for a moment so Dietrich could see the technique, the distribution of weight, the economy of motion that came from 40 years of doing this exact task. Then he set it down and stepped back. No words, no anger. Just a demonstration slow enough to follow. Dietrich stared. This wasn't how it worked. This wasn't how the world worked. You failed. You got punished. That was the system. That was how boys became men, through suffering and discipline, and the fear of failure driving you to try harder. But Rusty just waited, patient as stone weathered by decades of Texas wind. Dietrich tried again. This time he set the saddle against his hip like Rusty had shown him, let his legs carry the weight instead of his back and arms. It was still heavy, still awkward, but it was manageable. He could move with it, could carry it the 10 feet to where it needed to go. Something shifted in his chest. Not gratitude, not yet. Just confusion giving way to the first crack in his certainty about how the world had to be. The pattern repeated through the morning. Wolf fumbled with a rope, couldn't figure out the knot, and Rusty retied it slowly, letting him watch each twist and loop the over-under pattern that would hold under pressure. Klaus couldn't figure out how to put a bridle on a horse, kept getting the bit tangled with the reins, and Rusty gently took it from his hands, showed him the order of operations, then handed it back and let him try again. No shouting, no humiliation, no punishment for being slow or clumsy or weak, just teaching patient and steady as the sun moving across the sky. By lunch, Dietrich's arms ached from lifting saddles, and his hands had new blisters forming on top of the old ones from the training camps. But he could carry the equipment now, could do the work that was asked of him, and that mattered in a way he didn't fully understand yet, but felt in his bones. The days developed a rhythm that was both punishing and strangely comforting. Wake at dawn with the roosters, breakfast that was always more than they expected, work until the sun reached its zenith, lunch, more work until the light started to fail, dinner, sleep that came fast and deep. The tasks were simple at first, designed for boys who'd never done ranch labor. Mucking stalls, the monotonous work of shoveling manure and laying fresh hay. Hauling water in buckets that seemed to get heavier with each trip. Mending fence, learning to stretch barbed wire tight enough to hold but not so tight it would snap in the Texas wind. Grooming horses, brushing their coats until they gleamed in the sunlight. The work was hard, harder than marching in formation for hours, harder than drilling with rifles that were never fired. This demanded a different kind of strength, the endurance to keep going hour after hour under a sun that showed no mercy, no matter how tired you were or how much your muscles screamed. But the work was also honest. There was no ideology in shoveling manure, no propaganda in fixing a fence post. You did it right or you did it wrong, and the results were immediate and clear. A fence either held the cattle or it didn't. A horse was either comfortable or it wasn't. There was no room for speeches or theories, just the straightforward reality of the task. Dietrich found himself thinking less about Berlin and the war, and more about whether he'd stretched the wire tight enough, whether the horse he'd groomed was comfortable, whether the job was done well enough to meet Rusty's standards. The cowboys worked alongside them, not supervising so much as demonstrating. They showed by example how to lift without hurting your back, how to approach a nervous horse so it didn't spook, how to tell when a fence post was solid enough to hold or needed to be replaced. The one who'd brought them clothes was named Jackson, though everyone called him Dusty. He had dark eyes that seemed sad even when he smiled, and he worked harder than anyone, like he was trying to outrun something that lived inside him. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, every motion purposeful, nothing wasted. There was a younger cowboy, maybe 19, with red hair and freckles that covered his face like paint spatters, who laughed at everything and told jokes in English that the boys couldn't understand, but smiled at anyway because the joy was infectious. There was an older hand, heavy-set and quiet, who could read the weather by looking at the sky and knew where every head of cattle was at any given moment just by some sixth sense developed over decades. They treated the German boys like green recruits, not enemies. They marked failed attempts with good-natured ribbing that needed no translation, the kind of teasing that said, "You're one of us now, you're allowed to mess up, because we all did when we were learning, and we're here to help you get better." It was confusing. It was destabilizing. It made Dietrich question everything he thought he knew about how the world worked, and how people were supposed to relate to each other across the lines that separated nations and races. By the third week, something unexpected happened. The boys began to laugh. It started small. A nervous chuckle when Klaus tripped over his own feet carrying a bucket of water, spilling it everywhere. A surprised bark of laughter from Wolf when the red-haired cowboy made an exaggerated face mocking his own mistake with a rope. Then, louder, more genuine. The kind of laughter that came from relief and exhaustion and the slow release of fear that had been held too tight for too long. The kind that bubbled up from somewhere deep and surprised you with its force. One evening after dinner, Dusty built a fire in the pit outside the bunkhouse. The cowboys gathered around it, and after a moment's hesitation, so did the boys, drawn by the light and warmth as the Texas night settled in. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink and purple colors so vivid they seemed unreal. The air finally cooled to something bearable after the brutal heat of the day. Dusty pulled cigarettes from his pocket and passed them around without comment. The boys had never smoked before, but they took the offered cigarettes and tried coughing at first, then learning to let the smoke drift rather than inhale it deep. Wolf felt the harmonica in his pocket, the weight of it familiar and comforting. He'd carried it every day since they arrived this last piece of home, but hadn't taken it out. Hadn't felt ready. Now, with the fire crackling and the sky darkening and the sense that maybe, just maybe, these men weren't going to hurt them, he pulled it out, turned it over in his hands. The metal caught the firelight glinting. He lifted it to his lips and played a melody from home, something his father used to hum while working in the garden behind their house in Freiburg. A folk song from the Rhine Valley, slow and mournful and beautiful in the way that sad things can be when they carry the weight of memory and loss. The cowboys stopped talking. They listened, some staring into the fire, some watching Wolf's fingers move over the instrument with surprising skill for someone so young. When he finished, there was silence for a moment that felt sacred somehow, like a prayer had been offered and was being considered. Then Dusty stood, walked to the bunkhouse without explanation, and returned with a guitar that had seen better days, its finish worn smooth by years of use. He sat back down, tuned it with quick practiced movements, adjusting pegs until the sound satisfied him. Then he started playing. A Texas ballad about lost love and long roads and the loneliness of the open range, the kind of song cowboys had been singing for generations around fires just like this one. The melody was nothing like Wolf's song. Different key, different rhythm, different cultural tradition entirely. But somehow around that fire, with smoke rising toward the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, the two songs fit together. They occupied the same emotional space, the same territory of longing and loss and memory. Dietrich listened and felt something loosen in his chest. Some knot of tension that had been pulled tight since his father died, since the bombs fell, since the war became real, instead of just speeches and uniforms and marching songs about glory and destiny. Klaus closed his eyes and thought about his mother, and for the first time in months the thought didn't hurt quite so much. The ache was still there, but it was bearable, softened somehow by the music and the fire and the strange kindness of these men. When the music stopped, no one spoke for a long while. They just sat in the comfortable silence of people who'd shared something real, something that transcended language and nationality, and the fact that technically they were supposed to be enemies, locked in a struggle to the death. Later in his bunk, Dietrich tried to write a letter home. The guards would censor it, he knew. They'd black out anything that seemed like intelligence or information that might affect morale or the war effort. But he had to try anyway. "Mother," he wrote in careful German script, forming each letter precisely, "I am safe. The work is hard but fair. The men here are not what Berlin told us, They are harder than any soldier I have met, but hard in a different way. They do not hate us. I do not understand why, but they do not hate us." He paused, pen hovering over paper, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself, this fundamental shift in how he saw the world. "I think," he finally wrote, "that perhaps we were taught wrong about many things. I think perhaps the world is more complicated than we knew. I think perhaps there are different ways to be strong." He folded the letter, knowing the censors would probably black out half of it. But the act of writing it mattered more than whether it arrived intact. It was a way of processing what was happening to him, of trying to make sense of the confusion and the slow dissolution of certainty. That night, he dreamed of his father. Not the nightmare version where Gunther burned in the Hamburg fires, flesh melting from bone, but a memory from before when Dietrich was small. His father teaching him to tie his shoes, patient and calm, showing him the loops and crosses until Dietrich got it right. "Learning takes time," his father had said, voice gentle. "Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Real skill comes from practice and patience, not from fear or force." Rusty had that same patience, that same calm certainty that mistakes were part of the process, not crimes to be punished. That learning meant failing and trying again until you got it right. Dietrich woke with tears on his face, and the first real hope he'd felt since the war began. Hope that maybe there was a future beyond the war. Hope that maybe he could become someone other than a soldier in a cause that was crumbling. By the end of the 4th week, the boys had put on weight. Not much by normal standards, but enough to notice when you'd started from near starvation. Their jeans fit better, no longer hanging loose on skeletal frames. Their faces had lost that hollow skull-like look, flesh filling in the gaunt spaces. The blisters on their hands had hardened into calluses that spoke of work done and endurance built. They could saddle a horse now, most of them. Could muck a stall efficiently with the economy of motion that came from repetition. Could mend a fence well enough that it would hold through a Texas thunderstorm. Rusty watched them work and saw the transformation happening, slow as spring coming to frozen ground, but just as inevitable. They moved differently now. Less like soldiers marching in formation, rigid and uniform. More like workers who knew their task and took pride in doing it well, each finding their own rhythm and style. The swagger of Hitler youth training had given way to something steadier, a kind of quiet competence that came from doing hard work and doing it right, from earning respect through skill rather than demanding it through ideology. One morning, Rusty assigned Dietrich to help with the horses. They had 30 head that needed exercising, kept fit for the work ahead, and Rusty wanted to see if the boy could handle one on his own. Dietrich approached the horse. Rusty indicated a bay mare with kind eyes and a tendency to test new riders to see what they were made of. He'd watched the Cowboys do this dozens of times now. He knew the steps, had the pattern memorized. Saddle first. Check the blanket for wrinkles that could cause sores. Lift the saddle, settle it on the mare's back. Tighten the girth, but not too tight at first. The mare would hold her breath to keep it loose, so you had to wait, then tighten it again. Bridle next. Hold the bit against her teeth until she opened her mouth and accepted it. Settle the headstall over her ears carefully. Check that nothing was twisted or pinching. Mount from the left the way it had been done for centuries. The mare shifted when he climbed up, testing his balance, seeing if he'd fall off at the first unexpected movement. But he'd learned to move with her, to keep his center low and his hands steady on the reins. He clicked his tongue, applied pressure with his knees the way Rusty had taught him, and she moved forward. They walked around the corral first, Dietrich posting slightly to her rhythm, then trotted rising and falling with the gait, feeling the mare's muscles bunch and release beneath him, the power contained and directed by his subtle guidance. It wasn't perfect. His form was still rough around the edges, his timing occasionally off by a fraction, but it was good enough, functional, real. When he dismounted, Rusty nodded once. That was all. Just a nod, barely noticeable. But Dietrich felt it like a medal pinned to his chest. Approval earned through work, not given freely, or demanded by right of birth. Respect based on what you could do, not who your father was, or what country you came from, or what ideology you professed. That night around the fire, the red-haired cowboy taught them to roll cigarettes from loose tobacco and newspaper, his fingers moving fast, demonstrating the technique with the ease of long practice. The boys tried to copy him with varying degrees of success. Klaus ended up with tobacco everywhere, except in the paper, a mess of brown shreds scattered across his lap. Wolf managed a lumpy, crooked cigarette that fell apart when he tried to light it, tobacco spilling out both ends. Dietrich got one to hold together long enough to smoke, though it burned unevenly and tasted harsh. The Cowboys laughed, but it was the laughter of people watching friends learn, not the laughter of mockery or superiority. It was inclusive, welcoming, an invitation to keep trying until you got it right. Dusty showed them how to play cards, a simple game that relied more on luck than skill, easy enough for beginners. They played for matchsticks, since none of them had money, and Klaus won 3 hands in a row through sheer chance, which made him grin wider than anyone had seen since they arrived. Wolf played his harmonica again, trying different songs, some German folk tunes he remembered, some melodies he made up on the spot, improvising around the campfire's crackling rhythm. The music drifted across the ranch, carried by the night breeze. Inside the main house, Samuel Hardwick stood at his window and heard it. Felt something catch in his throat, a tightness that made it hard to swallow. His sons had been musical. James had played piano badly, but with such enthusiasm that it didn't matter. He'd attack the keys with more force than finesse, making the old upright ring with songs that were more noise than music, but filled the house with life. Robert had sung in the church choir, his tenor voice pure as water from a deep well, clear and true. James was dead. Killed at Tarawa in November of '43, shot through the chest while charging a Japanese machine gun nest. He'd been 22 years old, his whole life ahead of him, and he died on a beach whose name Samuel had never heard before and would never forget. Robert was somewhere in the Pacific training for what everyone knew would be the invasion of Japan proper. 19 years old and writing letters home that tried to sound brave but couldn't quite hide the fear beneath the surface, the knowledge that he might not make it back. Samuel stood at his window and listened to a German boy play harmonica, and he wondered what his sons were doing right now at this exact moment. Whether they were safe, whether they were afraid, whether they'd come home, or whether he'd get another telegram with words that would destroy what was left of his world. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was feeding and housing enemy soldiers, teaching them skills that might help them if they ever went back to fighting, treating them better than they'd probably been treated in their own military. And somewhere across the world, his own boys were fighting that same enemy, killing them or being killed by them in a war that seemed to have no end. War made no sense when you looked at it too closely. It only worked if you kept your distance, kept the enemy abstract and faceless. Numbers on a casualty report instead of boys who played music and laughed at bad jokes and missed their families. But these boys had faces, had names, had fears and dreams and lives that had been interrupted by forces beyond their control, just like his own sons. Samuel had no answers. He just stood at his window and listened to the music and prayed his sons would make it home. Prayed that somehow, some way this madness would end and the world could start healing. Outside, around the fire, Dietrich looked at the faces illuminated by the flames. Cowboys and prisoners, enemies on paper, but something else in practice. Something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of war. He thought about what Rusty had said with that single word on their first day work. Not hate, not revenge, not punishment, just work. And somehow, in that simplicity, in that focus on the task at hand, rather than the politics and ideology behind it, something had shifted. The war still raged across the ocean. Men still killed each other by the thousands in the name of countries and causes. But here on this ranch, in this small pocket of Texas dust and mesquite smoke, 17 boys were learning that maybe strength didn't require cruelty. Maybe teaching was harder than breaking. Maybe building took more courage than destroying. They were learning that the world Berlin had taught them was just one version of reality, and not necessarily the truest one. August came with heat that made July seem merciful by comparison. The sun rose earlier and set later, and the hours between were a test of endurance that separated those who could take it from those who couldn't. The 17 German boys took it and kept working, kept pushing through the exhaustion and the heat that turned the ranch into something close to an oven. Their bodies had changed in ways that went beyond the weight they'd gained. Dietrich Albrecht, who'd arrived at 89 pounds, now weighed 118. His shoulders had broadened from lifting saddles and fence posts day after day. His hands, once soft from city life, bore calluses thick enough to grip rope without flinching, the kind of calluses that took months to build. Wolfgang Richter had put on 26 pounds of muscle that showed in his arms and chest, and his arms no longer trembled when he threw a lasso. He could rope a calf faster than some of the ranch hands, now his movements fluid and confident in a way that would have seemed impossible 2 months ago. Klaus Brenner, the smallest at 14, had grown from 76 pounds to 103. He still didn't speak much, still kept his thoughts to himself. But he'd developed an uncanny ability to read cattle, to predict which way they'd move before they moved, to sense the mood of the herd just by watching them graze. The Cowboys had noticed started putting him in positions where that skill mattered. The transformation wasn't just physical. Something in their eyes had changed. The fear that had defined them in July, that had made them flinch at sudden movements and expect brutality at every turn, had burned away like morning fog in the Texas sun. It was replaced by something steadier, harder to define. Confidence maybe, but earned rather than assumed. They moved with purpose now, with the quiet assurance of people who knew they could do hard things and do them well. Rusty watched this transformation with the satisfaction of a craftsman seeing raw material shaped into something useful, something with value. He didn't comment on it directly, didn't praise them or make a show of their progress. He just gave them harder tasks, trusted them with more responsibility, and let the work itself be the reward. On the 18th of August, that trust was tested in a way none of them expected. The day started normal enough. Breakfast at dawn, eggs and bacon and cornbread, then out to the range to check on a herd that had drifted toward the eastern boundary during the night. Rusty led the group, Dusty and the red-haired cowboy named Charlie riding alongside. Dietrich, Wolf and Klaus came with them, along with 4 other German boys who'd proven they could handle horses well enough to be useful in the field, rather than a liability. The cattle were spread across a draw between 2 low hills, grazing on buffalo grass that grew thick in the shallow valley where water collected when it rained. About 40 head, mostly cows with calves, a few steers. They looked peaceful, content, exactly as they should. Rusty dismounted to check a fence line that ran along the draw, looking for breaks where cattle might wander through. Dusty did the same, handing his reins to Charlie while he walked the wire, bending to examine posts and connections. That's when the rattlesnake struck. It came from under a rock, 6 feet of scaled fury, moving faster than thought, faster than anything that size should be able to move. It missed Dusty's boot by inches, fangs snapping on empty air. But the strike was close enough to spook his horse. The animal reared eyes rolling white with panic and jerked the reins from Charlie's grip with a violence that nearly pulled the young cowboy from his own saddle. The sudden movement spooked the nearest cow. She bolted, bellowing in alarm, and that panic spread through the herd like fire through dry grass. 40 head of cattle, each weighing 1,000 pounds, suddenly decided to run in 40 different directions, responding to instinct older than thought. Charlie's horse danced sideways, caught off balance by the chaos erupting around it. Charlie, trying to control both horses, couldn't maintain his seat. He tumbled from the saddle, hit the ground hard, rolled once. He came up on his knees just as a massive Hereford bull, confused and aggressive, and seeing movement where there shouldn't be, locked eyes on him and charged. 2,000 pounds of muscle and horn closing the distance at a speed that seemed impossible for something that large. The ground shook with each pounding step. Charlie tried to stand to run, but his ankle had twisted in the fall and it buckled under his weight when he put pressure on it. Dusty was 30 yards away, too far to help. Rusty was on foot, no way to intercept. Dietrich didn't think. Thinking would have meant calculating odds, measuring risks, remembering that he was a prisoner who had no obligation to risk his life for his captors. Thinking would have meant hesitation, and hesitation meant death. Instead, he kicked his horse into motion. The mare responded instantly, years of training overriding her natural fear of the chaos erupting around them. They cut across the path of the charging bull at an angle that brought them between the animal and its target. Dietrich leaned low in the saddle, reaching down with his right arm. His fingers closed on the collar of Charlie's shirt, and he hauled upward with strength he didn't know he had, strength born of desperation and the muscle he'd built over 2 months of ranch work. Charlie's weight nearly pulled him from the saddle. 160 pounds of cowboy hanging from his arm while he tried to maintain his seat on a horse moving at full gallop. But Dietrich clamped his legs tight around the horse's barrel and held on every muscle in his body, engaged in the effort. The mare swerved hard, driven by Dietrich's knee pressure and her own survival instinct. The bull thundered past so close that Dietrich felt the heat of its body and smelled the rank musk of its rage, a smell like wet earth and fury. He didn't stop moving. Kept the horse running until they were clear of the scattered herd, then reined in and half-lowered, half-dropped Charlie to the ground. Charlie stood on his good leg, the other held off the ground, breathing hard. His face was pale, eyes wide with the shock of what had almost happened. He looked up at Dietrich with an expression that contained too many emotions to name or separate. Dietrich just nodded once, the way Rusty had taught him to acknowledge a job done right, nothing more needed. Then he turned his horse back toward the chaos to help round up the scattered cattle because the work wasn't finished and standing around wouldn't get it done. It took 2 hours to get the herd settled and back together, 2 hours of hard riding in the August heat. By the time they returned to the ranch, the sun was past its zenith and heading toward afternoon, the shadows lengthening. Nobody spoke much on the ride back. Charlie rode double with Dusty, his ankles swelling inside his boot until they had to cut the leather to get it off. The other cowboys kept glancing at Dietrich like they were seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile what they'd witnessed with their assumptions about who and what these German boys were. That evening, after dinner, Dusty approached Dietrich by the corral. The German boy was brushing down his mare, taking care of the animal that had saved Charlie's life as much as he had, maybe more. The mare stood patient while he worked, responding to his touch with the trust that came from good handling. Dusty stood there for a long moment, just watching the careful way Dietrich moved the brush across the mare's coat, the attention he paid to every detail. Then he stepped forward and extended his hand. Dietrich looked at it. In the Hitler Youth, they'd been taught that Americans were weak, that their handshakes were limp and meaningless, that physical contact with the enemy was contamination, that you could catch their degeneracy through touch, through association. But Dusty's hand was as calloused as his own, scarred from rope burns and fence wire and 45 years of hard living. And the look in his eyes wasn't weak. It was the same look Dietrich had seen in his father's eyes when Gunther came home from the factory, exhausted but satisfied with a day's honest work. The look of a man who knew himself and what he was worth. Dietrich took his hand. Their grips met firm and equal, the handshake of men who'd shared something real, something that mattered. "Thank you," Dusty said in careful German, 2 words he'd learned specifically for this moment, practicing with one of the other hands, who spoke a little of the language. Dietrich nodded. Words felt inadequate to the moment, so he didn't try to find them. Just met Dusty's eyes and let the silence carry what needed to be said. That night around the fire, something fundamental had changed. The invisible line that had separated cowboys from prisoners, Americans from Germans, us from them, it had blurred to the point of irrelevance, maybe disappeared entirely. Charlie sat with his ankle propped up on a log, wrapped in cloth soaked with liniment that smelled sharp and medicinal. He kept looking at Dietrich, shaking his head slightly, like he couldn't quite believe what had happened, couldn't process that his life had been saved by someone wearing the uniform of the enemy, however metaphorically. Wolf played his harmonica, and this time Dusty didn't wait for an invitation or permission. He picked up his guitar and joined in, immediately finding harmonies that shouldn't have worked, given the different musical traditions, but somehow did anyway. The music swelled into the Texas night, carried by wind across the mesquite and sage, and for those few moments, nationality meant nothing. Ideology meant nothing. There was only the music and the fire, and the shared understanding that they'd all witnessed something that couldn't be explained by propaganda or politics. An enemy had risked his life to save one of them. That changed everything. Later that week, over several nights by the fire, as trust built and walls came down, Dusty told them about his brother. It came out slowly in fragments and false starts, the way difficult truths always do. William Brennan had been 23 when he shipped out for Europe in early 1944. He'd landed at Normandy on D-Day +2 June 8th, with the 4th Infantry Division part of the massive wave of men thrown against the Atlantic Wall. His letters home had been regular at first. One every week or two, carefully cheerful in that way, soldiers wrote to keep their families from worrying too much. He described the French countryside, green and rolling and beautiful despite the destruction. He made jokes about army food that was somehow worse than ranch cooking, which was saying something. He asked about the ranch, about the horses, about whether the spring calves had been healthy. Then, in late July, the letters stopped. No explanation, no warning, no telegram from the War Department saying he'd been killed or wounded or captured. Just silence, where his words used to be an absence that grew heavier with each passing week. Dusty had written to William's commanding officer, had contacted the Red Cross, had done everything a man could do from 4,000 miles away, pulling every string and calling in every favor. But the answers he got back were vague, contradictory. Missing in action, possibly wounded, status being investigated. Nothing definite, nothing he could hold on to. The not knowing was worse than knowing would have been. At least death had finality, a stopping point where grief could begin its work. This was just endless waiting, endless hoping and dreading in equal measure, wondering if the next letter would bring news or if the silence would just stretch on forever. Wolf listened to this and thought about his own father, about the night the bombs fell on Freiburg and the fire that consumed everything turned his world to ash and rubble. At least he knew. At least he had certainty, however terrible. He told Dusty this in broken English, supplemented with hand gestures and the occasional German word that Dusty had learned by now through daily contact. "My father," Wolf said, forming the words carefully, tongue working around unfamiliar sounds. "Died. Bombs. English bombs." He expected anger. Expected Dusty to remember suddenly that Wolf was German, that Wolf's countrymen were the reason England had to drop bombs in the first place, that the whole chain of violence and suffering led back to decisions made in Berlin by men in uniforms covered with medals. but Dusty just nodded, his expression pained with shared understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it, the words carrying genuine weight. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Then Dusty spoke again, searching for words in his limited German. "Your father. Good man." Wolf nodded vigorously. "Yes, good man. Factory worker. Hard work. Played music." He mimed, playing piano fingers, moving over invisible keys. "My brother," Dusty said slowly. "Good man, too. Worked cattle. Laughed. Always laughed. Made jokes, even bad ones." The conversation didn't erase the war, didn't bring back the dead or locate the missing, didn't solve anything or fix anything or change the fundamental reality that they were on opposite sides of a conflict that had killed millions. But it did something more important, something more fundamental. It made both sides human to each other. Dusty looked at Wolf and didn't see a German, didn't see the enemy or the ideology or the uniform or the years of propaganda about Aryan superiority and racial destiny. He saw a 16-year-old kid who'd lost his father and missed him, which was something Dusty understood bone deep, a universal language of grief that transcended nationality. And Wolf looked at Dusty and didn't see an American, didn't see the degeneracy or weakness Berlin had taught him to expect in democratic societies. He saw a man carrying grief with quiet dignity, refusing to let it break him or turn him cruel, which was something Wolf recognized because he carried the same burden. Klaus, listening from the edge of the firelight where the darkness was starting to gather, thought about his mother, about the letters that had stopped coming, about not knowing whether she was alive or dead or suffering or safe. The not knowing that ate at him every day, every hour, making it hard to focus on anything else. The not knowing was its own kind of torture, maybe worse than certain knowledge would have been. September brought the first hints that summer might eventually end, though the heat remained brutal. But the quality of light changed subtly, the angle of the sun shifting as the earth continued its ancient rotation. Sunsets lasted longer, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed almost apologetic for the brutality of the months before. Rusty announced that he'd be taking Dietrich and Wolf on a 3-day cattle drive to a neighboring ranch 60 miles north. They needed to deliver 20 head of steers payment for a debt or part of some long-standing arrangement between ranchers. The journey would be good experience for the boys, a chance to see more of Texas and learn skills beyond what the home ranch could teach. They left on the 10th of September just after dawn, when the air still held a hint of coolness. 3 horses, 20 cattle, and enough supplies for the trip strapped to a pack mule that had made this journey dozens of times and knew the route better than any of them. The land they crossed was vast and empty, broken only by occasional stands of mesquite and the distant shimmer of heat haze that made the horizon waver and dance. It was beautiful in its emptiness, in its refusal to be anything other than what it was. They rode in silence mostly. Rusty wasn't a man who filled quiet with talk, and the boys had learned that silence could be comfortable if you let it, that not everything needed to be put into words. The work of moving cattle was constant, but not difficult once you understood the rhythm. The steers were docile, accustomed to being driven, and they followed the horse in front with minimal encouragement. The real skill was in reading the land, knowing where water would be, where the footing was solid, where a gully might hide dangers that could break a horse's leg or scatter the herd. Rusty taught by doing, riding ahead to scout, then returning to show them what he'd found and why it mattered. A dried creek bed that would be treacherous in rain, the banks too steep and the bottom too unstable. A stand of prickly pear that cattle would avoid, creating a natural barrier that could be used to guide them. The way shadows lengthened differently depending on the season and how you could judge the time by reading them if you knew what to look for. On the second night, they made camp beside a creek that still held water despite the summer drought, a precious resource in this dry land. Rusty got a fire going while the boys tended the horses and checked on the cattle, making sure none had wandered off or gotten injured. After they ate beans and hardtack and coffee that could strip paint, Rusty leaned back against his saddle and looked up at the stars. They were spectacular out here, away from any town, lights, away from anything human. So bright and numerous it seemed impossible that there was any darkness left at all between them. The beans had been cooked over the fire with salt pork, simple trail food that cowboys had eaten for generations. But to Dietrich, even this tasted better than anything in the training camps. The pork fat had melted into the beans, making them rich and filling. The hardtack, though tough as leather, had substance. The coffee was bitter and strong, stripping the taste from your mouth, but it kept you warm as the night air cooled. Simple food, honest food, the kind that fueled work, not ideology. You boys know why I came to America, Rusty said, suddenly breaking the silence in a way that felt significant. Dietrich and Wolf exchanged glances. Rusty rarely spoke about himself, about his past. This felt important, like a door opening. No, sir, Dietrich said in careful English, the words coming easier now after 2 months of daily exposure. Rusty was quiet for a moment, considering his words, deciding how much to share. I was born in Poland, 1881. Long time ago now. My father worked in a factory, died when I was 12. Accident. Machine caught his arm, pulled him in. They gave my mother 20 zloty and told her to be grateful it wasn't worse. He paused, poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. We had nothing after that. 5 children, no father, no money coming in. I was oldest, so I needed to work, but there was no work. Not for Polish boys, not for the right wage. The factory wouldn't hire me because I was too young, and everywhere else paid starvation wages. He shifted, stretched his legs out toward the fire's warmth. So I left. Came to America. 1893. 12 years old, spoke no English, had 1 pair of shoes that were already falling apart. Got on a ship with nothing but what I could carry. Wolf listened, trying to imagine Rusty as a boy his own age, alone in a foreign country, everything he knew left behind. Why Texas? Dietrich asked. Rusty smiled slightly, the firelight catching the creases around his eyes. Didn't choose Texas, exactly. Texas chose me. I needed work, found it here. First job was mucking stalls for a ranch outside San Antonio. Paid almost nothing, but I got meals and a place to sleep. That was enough. He shifted, his expression darkening at the memory. The foreman there was a man named Carson. Meanest son of a bitch I ever met. Beat his workers for sport, cheated them on wages, treated everyone like they were dirt under his boots, especially immigrants, especially Poles. But he taught you? Wolf asked. No, Rusty said firmly, his voice hard. He taught me what not to be. I learned ranching despite him, not because of him. Watched the other hands, asked questions when he wasn't around, practiced when I was supposed to be sleeping. And when I got good enough, I left. Found work with a man named Thomas Hardwick, Samuel's grandfather. He gestured back toward Mesquite Springs, somewhere 60 miles south in the darkness. Thomas was different. He was hard, don't get me wrong. Worked us dawn to dusk, expected excellence, didn't tolerate laziness or sloppy work. But he was fair. He judged a man by what he could do, not where he came from. He paid what he promised, treated his workers like they mattered, like they had dignity. Rusty looked directly at the boys, his pale blue eyes reflecting the firelight. That's when I learned the most important thing about America, about Texas, about the West. What? Dietrich asked, leaning forward. Your past doesn't matter as much as your present. Where you came from matters less than what you do now today in this moment. You earn your place through deeds, not birthright, through work, not words. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning and implication. Wolf thought about Germany, about the endless emphasis on blood and heritage and racial destiny, about being told that he was superior because of who his ancestors were, because of genetic traits he had no control over, not because of anything he'd done himself or any skill he'd developed. Dietrich thought about the Hitler youth training, about being sorted and ranked and judged based on conformity to an ideal he'd never questioned until now, about tests of racial purity and genealogical charts that supposedly proved superiority. In Germany, Wolf said slowly, working through the English, they say some people are better, born better, because of blood, because of... He struggled for the word ancestors. Rusty snorted a sound of dismissal. I've known men from every country, every background you can imagine, Poles and Germans and Irish and Mexicans and Negroes and Chinese and everything else. And I'll tell you what I learned over 40 years, there are good men and bad men in every group. The good ones work hard, keep their word, treat others fair. The bad ones don't. That's all that matters. Everything else is just stories people tell themselves to feel special. He stood, dusted off his pants with weathered hands. Now, one of you needs to take first watch on the cattle. Other can sleep. We rotate every 3 hours. Decide between yourselves. He walked off toward his bedroll, leaving the boys to decide who would watch first. Dietrich volunteered without being asked. He sat by the dying fire, watching the dark shapes of cattle barely visible in the starlight, and thought about what Rusty had said. Your past doesn't matter as much as your present. He'd been taught that his entire identity was tied to being German, to the glorious history and 1,000-year destiny of the fatherland. That his worth came from his bloodline, his racial purity, his conformity to the ideals of the Reich. That some people were simply born better than others, and that was an unchangeable fact of nature. But here was Rusty, a Polish immigrant who'd built a life through sheer competence and hard work. who judged others the same way, by what they could do, rather than who they were. Who'd looked at 17 enemy prisoners and seen not Germans or Nazis or ideological opponents, but just boys who needed teaching. The stars wheeled overhead, infinite and indifferent to human conflicts. Somewhere under these same stars, men were killing each other by the thousands in the name of countries and causes. Dietrich's countrymen were fighting Rusty's countrymen, and the dying on both sides probably believed they were right, believed their cause was just, believed God or history or destiny was on their side. But out here on this empty land, under this vast sky, those certainties seemed small and fragile. What mattered was whether you could do the work, whether you kept your word, whether you helped when help was needed, like Dietrich had helped Charlie, like Rusty helped them every day without asking for anything in return. The rest, the politics and propaganda and national pride, felt like noise, like static, obscuring something simpler and more true. When Wolf came to relieve him 3 hours later, Dietrich lay in his bedroll and stared up at the stars and wondered what kind of man he'd have become if he'd grown up here instead of Germany. Different, he thought, fundamentally different, and he wasn't sure yet if that was something to mourn or celebrate. They reached the neighbouring ranch on the afternoon of the third day, delivered the steers without incident, and turned back toward Mesquite Springs. The return journey felt shorter, the land more familiar, like they'd carved a path through it that would always be theirs now. When they rode back through the ranch gate on September 14th, Klaus ran out to meet them, agitated in a way they'd never seen before. The younger boy was usually calm, reserved, but now his face was tight with worry. "Men came," he said in German, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Official men, from the camp. They talked to Mr. Hardwick and Rusty for a long time. They weren't happy about something." Dietrich dismounted quickly, concern flooding through him. "About what?" "About us. About how we're being treated here. They used the word fraternization. They said it wasn't allowed, that there are rules about how prisoners should be kept." Wolf and Dietrich exchanged glances, a sinking feeling in their stomachs. They'd known this couldn't last forever. Had known that somewhere someone would notice that the line between prisoner and worker had blurred beyond recognition, that they'd been treated more like ranch hands than enemy captives. That evening, the atmosphere in the dining hall was strained in a way it hadn't been since those first few days. The Cowboys were quieter than usual, their conversations muted. The boys felt it immediately, that shift back toward formality and distance that had been absent for weeks. After dinner, they gathered by the bunkhouse, but no one built a fire. It felt wrong somehow, presumptuous, like they'd been caught doing something forbidden. Dusty walked over after a few minutes, his expression conflicted, torn between different loyalties. He spoke in English, and one of the boys who'd picked up more of the language translated for the others.
"The camp commandant came today. He heard reports that we were getting too friendly with you all. Someone must have written a letter, complained to headquarters. He said it violates the Geneva Conventions. Said prisoners are supposed to be kept separate, supervised properly, not integrated into the workforce like regular hands." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Hardwick and Rusty told him we're following the rules. You work, we supervise, everything's proper and documented." But he wasn't convinced. He's going to be watching closer now, sending inspectors. And we have to be more careful about how things look. The weight of it settled over them like a blanket suffocating. They'd been living in a bubble, a small pocket of normalcy in an abnormal world. But the world had noticed and was reasserting itself, reminding them that there were rules and hierarchies and barriers that couldn't be ignored forever. That night, there was no music, no cards, no cigarettes shared around a fire. Just boys in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls close in again. The easy camaraderie they'd built over 2 months felt suddenly fragile, like something that could be taken away by bureaucratic decree. But Rusty Kowalski hadn't survived 40 years in Texas by letting bureaucrats tell him how to run a ranch. The next morning he gathered everyone, cowboys and prisoners, both in the barn. The early light slanted through gaps in the walls, creating bars of illumination in the dusty air. He stood in front of them, weathered and bow-legged and immovable as stone. "The war's going to end someday," he said, his voice carrying in the enclosed space. Dietrich translated for those who still needed it, though most understood English well enough by now. "Could be this year, could be next. Don't matter when. Until then, we got work to do." He looked at each person in turn, his pale blue eyes missing nothing, taking measure of each man's resolve. "The commandant can make his rules. We'll follow them, every letter of the law. But the work doesn't change. A fence needs mending, we mend it. Cattle need moving, we move them. And if I need to teach someone how to do that work right, I'm going to teach them. That's not fraternization. That's running a ranch." He picked up a coiled rope from a nearby post and tossed it to Dietrich with casual ease.
New technique for calf roping. Learned it from a hand down in Laredo last year. You're going to learn it, and then you're going to teach it to Dusty. He's been doing it wrong for 20 years and won't listen to me when I tell him." The Cowboys chuckled at that, the tension breaking slightly. Dusty shook his head, but he was smiling, accepting the ribbing in good humor. That simple gesture, tossing the rope, giving Dietrich authority to teach a cowboy an enemy prisoner, instructing an American, restored everything the commandant's visit had threatened to take away. They weren't brothers. Rusty didn't say that, didn't need to. The word would have been too obvious a violation of the rules being imposed from outside. They were workers on a ranch doing a job that needed doing. Cowboys and hands and learners all focused on the same tasks. And if that job required mutual respect and shared knowledge and occasional moments of humanity, well, that was just good management. That was just the way work had to be done if you wanted it done right. The commandant's rules would be followed to the letter. But the spirit of the ranch that couldn't be regulated or controlled by men in offices hundreds of miles away. As the boys dispersed to their morning tasks, Wolf caught Dusty's eye and nodded a gesture of understanding and gratitude. Dusty nodded back the same acknowledgement. The fire hadn't gone out. It had just been banked coals, still glowing beneath the ash, ready to burn bright again when the moment was right. October passed in a rhythm the boys had come to know like breathing. The work continued steady and demanding, the kind of labor that filled your days and exhausted your body, but left your mind clear. The heat finally broke, replaced by cooler nights that made the morning rides almost pleasant, the air crisp and clean. The boys' weight continued to climb. Dietrich hit 127 pounds by month's end, Klaus 108. They were unrecognizable from the skeletal figures who'd arrived 3 months prior, their bodies transformed by labor and proper food. The commandant's watchful eye had faded. The work spoke for itself, and even the most suspicious bureaucrat couldn't argue with a ranch running at peak efficiency. The inspectors who came found everything proper documented within regulations. But November brought cold nights, and the first hints that the world beyond the ranch still turned, still burned, still bled. The news arrived in fragments carried by radio broadcasts in the main house that Samuel Hardwick listened to each evening, his face growing harder with each report. Newspapers delivered weekly from Hebronville, their headlines speaking of Allied advances and German retreats, cities falling and armies dissolving like sugar in water. The boys heard it all secondhand, translated by the guards, or whispered between themselves in the bunkhouse after dark. They learned that their country was collapsing, that the armies they'd been taught were invincible were being pushed back on all fronts, that the 1,000-year Reich was burning down after barely 12 years. The news should have devastated them, should have filled them with shame or rage or desperate patriotism, the kind that made men fight harder even when the cause was lost. Instead, it felt distant, like something happening to strangers in a place that no longer had anything to do with them. What mattered was whether they'd fixed the fence in the south pasture properly, whether the new calf born last week was nursing well from its mother, whether they could master the new rope technique Rusty was teaching them, the one from Laredo that was supposedly faster and more efficient. The ranch had become their world, and everything outside it felt increasingly unreal, like a story someone was telling about people they'd never met. But on November 22nd, reality forced its way back in with a cruelty that couldn't be ignored. Klaus received a letter from the Red Cross, one of those thin envelopes that always carried bad news. It had been delayed, rerouted, sent to the wrong camp twice, according to the stamps on it. Half the words were blacked out by censors, entire sentences reduced to dark bars. But enough remained to convey the essential fact, the one piece of information that mattered. His mother was dead. Killed in an air raid on Dresden, October 7th, 1944. The letter was dated October 20th, but the military postal system had lost it, found it sent it to the wrong camp twice before finally delivering it to a 14-year-old boy who'd been waiting more than a year to hear from her. Klaus read it once, his face blank and still. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his pocket and walked out of the bunkhouse toward the empty land beyond the corrals, toward the horizon where Texas stretched into infinity. Dietrich followed at a distance, not sure what to do or say, but knowing Klaus shouldn't be alone with this, not now. He found the younger boy sitting on a fence rail, staring at nothing, seeing something far away. The Texas sky was enormous above them, cloudless and blue and indifferent to human suffering, vast enough to swallow all the grief in the world without noticing. Dietrich climbed up and sat beside him. They didn't speak for a long time, just sat together in silence. Finally, Klaus said in German, his voice barely above a whisper, "I kept hoping the letters would start again, that she was just busy or the mail was delayed or something. I knew it was foolish, but I kept hoping anyway. And now I know. She's been dead for more than a month and I didn't even know. I was here learning to rope cattle and she was already gone." Dietrich nodded. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be hollow, that wouldn't trivialize what Klaus was feeling. "The last letter I got," Klaus continued, his voice steady, despite everything she wrote about spring. "About how the garden would bloom again when the war ended. About teaching me to plant vegetables the way her father taught her. She was planning for after. She thought she had time." He pulled the Red Cross letter from his pocket, looked at it like it was something poisonous, something that could kill with a touch. She died in October. When she wrote that letter about spring, about the future, she had less than 2 months left. And she didn't know. She thought she'd see spring again, thought she'd see me again. The wind blew across the scrubland, carrying the smell of sage and dust and distance. "Berlin told us we were conquering the world," Klaus said, and there was something fierce in his voice now. Anger breaking through the numbness. Building something glorious, something that would last forever, something worth any sacrifice. And now my mother's dead for it, and Berlin's burning, and I'm in Texas learning to rope cattle, and I don't know what any of it means.
"I don't know what it was for." He laughed a sound with no humor in it at all. "They said we'd conquer, but Texas showed us how to live in it instead. And I still don't know which one my mother would have wanted. I don't know if she'd be proud or ashamed of what I've become here." Dietrich struggled for words, for something that would help. He thought about his own father, about the Hamburg fires, about all the death and destruction that had been sold to them as necessary sacrifices for a greater good that was never defined, never explained beyond slogans and symbols. "I think," he said slowly, carefully, "that maybe riding isn't about destination. It's about knowing how, about being able to sit a horse and move with it and do the work that needs doing. The point is the doing itself, not where it takes you. Maybe your mother would understand that." Klaus looked at him, eyes red but dry past tears for now. "That doesn't bring her back?" "No," Dietrich agreed, his voice firm. "Nothing brings them back. The dead stay dead no matter what we do. But maybe the way we honor them is by becoming men who build instead of destroy, who teach instead of hate, who choose to create something rather than burning everything down, the way Rusty does, the way they've taught us here." A shadow fell across them. Rusty had approached without sound, the way he did, moving quiet as a ghost, despite his age and the bow in his legs. He didn't ask what was wrong, didn't offer empty comfort or platitudes about God's plan or things happening for a reason. He just stood there for a moment. Then he spoke. "Lost my mother when I was 19, he said, his voice rough with old grief. "Cholera. Died in 3 days' fever, burning her up from the inside. I was working a cattle drive in West Texas, couldn't get back in time. Didn't even know she was sick until I got the letter saying she was buried. She was gone and I never got to say goodbye." He looked out at the same horizon Klaus had been staring at, seeing something from 44 years ago. "Spent a year angry after that. Angry at God for taking her. Angry at the disease. Angry at myself for not being there, for choosing work over family. The anger didn't help. Didn't change anything. Just made the work harder. Made everything taste like ash." He turned to Klaus, pale blue eyes, seeing everything, missing nothing. "Your mother's gone. That's a fact, and facts don't care about fair. But you're still here. You're alive. And what you do with being alive, that's the only thing you get to control. Everything else is just wind." He reached out and gripped Klaus's shoulder, brief and firm, the kind of touch that said more than words ever could. "You can honor her by giving up, by letting this break you and turn you bitter. Or you can honor her by becoming someone she'd be proud of. Someone who survived and built something from the survival. Your choice." "Nobody can make it for you." Then he walked away back toward the barn, leaving the boys alone with the wind and the sky and the weight of decisions they were too young to have to make, but had to make anyway. December brought news that hit Dusty like a physical blow. His brother William was confirmed killed in action, not missing anymore, not possibly wounded or captured. Dead. Shot by a German sniper outside a French village called Mortain on October 7th, though the official notification had taken 2 months to work its way through military bureaucracy. Dusty received the telegram at breakfast, read it once, his face going white, then grey, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket. Then he stood up without a word and walked out of the dining hall into the cold December morning. The boys watched him go, feeling the weight of it settle over the room like smoke.
One of the German soldiers Dusty's brother had been fighting, had pulled a trigger. Maybe it wasn't anyone in this room, but it was someone wearing the same uniform they'd worn, fighting for the same cause they'd believed in, following orders from the same chain of command. Wolf found Dusty an hour later, sitting by the corral, just sitting and staring at nothing. He approached carefully, unsure of his welcome, half expecting to be told to leave to finally face the hatred that had been missing since they arrived. Instead, Dusty just looked at him and said, he was 23. Had a girl back in Oklahoma he was going to marry when he got home. Name was Sarah Miller. Wrote about her in every letter about the house they were going to build, the life they were going to have together. She doesn't know yet. I have to write to her. Wolf sat down on the fence beside him, leaving space between them. I'm sorry, he said, in his careful English, the words inadequate but necessary. Very, very sorry. They sat in silence for a while, two men on opposite sides of grief. Then Dusty spoke again, his voice steady despite everything. I hated Germans when this started. Hated them with everything I had. They'd started this war, killed millions, threatened everything decent in the world. And my brother was over there fighting them, risking everything to stop them. I wanted every one of you dead. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it with hands that only shook slightly, drew the smoke deep into his lungs. But then you all showed up here, just kids, scared and half-starved and believing lies just like everyone else believes lies. And I had to ask myself, what am I hating? The country, the uniform, the idea, or just people who never had any choice in any of this? Wolf listened, not trusting himself to speak, afraid anything he said would break this fragile moment. My brother's dead because of Germany, Dusty continued. That's a fact, but you didn't kill him. Probably some kid just like you did it, just as scared, just as lied to, who pulled a trigger, because that's what kids in uniforms do when old men tell them to. Just following orders, just doing what he was told was right. He looked at Wolf directly, his sad eyes meeting Wolf's. I can hate that system. The one that puts kids in uniforms and sends them to kill each other over things they don't understand for causes that don't make sense. But hating you, individual human beings just trying to survive, what does that solve? What does that fix? Wolf felt tears on his face and didn't wipe them away, letting them fall. My father. English bombs kill him. I hate English. Hate them so much. But English, they drop bombs because German planes bomb London first, and German planes bomb London because... He trailed off, unable to follow the chain of cause and effect back to any point where it made sense, where someone could say, this is where it started and this is who's to blame. Because hatred feeds itself. Dusty finished for him, his voice heavy with understanding. And once it starts, it just grows and grows until there's nothing left but ashes and graves and more hatred. They sat together until the sun started its descent toward the horizon. Two men mourning on opposite sides of a war neither had chosen. And somehow that shared grief was more powerful than all the propaganda in the world. February 19th, 1945. Samuel Hardwick received the telegram during dinner, a runner bringing it to the door because telegrams never brought good news, especially not during wartime. He read it standing in the doorway, backlit by the evening light, his face going pale, then grey, then stone. His son Robert had been killed on Iwo Jima, 19 years old, shot leading his squad up a beach called Red One under machine gun fire so intense the sand itself seemed to boil with impacts. He died instantly, the telegram said, as if that was supposed to be a comfort, as if dying quickly made it better somehow. Samuel folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket with hands that shook despite his best efforts to control them. Then he walked to his office and closed the door, and the sounds that came from behind it made the ranch hands look away and pretend they heard nothing, giving him the privacy to grieve. Both sons now, James at Tarawa, Robert at Iwo Jima. The Pacific had swallowed his entire bloodline, taken everything he'd hoped to leave behind, everyone who would carry his name forward. The ranch fell silent in a way that went beyond mere quiet. Cowboys moved like ghosts, spoke in whispers when they had to speak at all. The boys felt it like a physical presence. This grief that hung over everything made the air itself heavy. Dietrich thought about Samuel's kindness in housing them, feeding them, allowing Rusty to teach them. The man had lost one son and was waiting for news of the other when they arrived. Had known what it was to have his children fighting soldiers who wore the same uniform these boys wore. And still he'd chosen to see them as boys, not enemies. Now the second son was gone, and the boys responsible wore different uniforms, fought in a different ocean. But the equation was the same. Enemy soldiers had killed Samuel's sons, and here he was, still housing, still feeding, still teaching enemy soldiers. The weight of that choice, that daily decision not to hate, seemed almost unbearable. That evening, Rusty called the boys together outside the bunkhouse. His face was harder than they'd seen it, aged 10 years in a single day, every one of his 63 years showing in the lines around his eyes. "Mr. Hardwick lost his boy today," he said, without preamble, his voice flat and hard. "His second. Both sons dead now, fighting the same war you all served in different sides of it." He let that sit for a moment, let the weight of it sink in.
He could send you away, could ask the camp to transfer you somewhere else, somewhere harder, work you like punishment detail, feed you less, make your lives miserable. He'd be within his rights. Most men would do exactly that. The boys waited, fear creeping back in like fog after months of its absence. "He's not going to do that," Rusty continued, "because he's a better man than most. But you need to understand what it costs him to look at you every day and choose not to hate. You need to honor that choice by being worth it, by becoming men who deserve the second chance you're getting." He turned to go, then stopped. "War makes everybody lose. Everybody. Winners and losers both. The only thing that matters is what you build after when the smoke clears and the graves are dug."
The news of Germany's collapse came in steady waves through March and April, each report bringing word of another city fallen, another army surrendered, another piece of the Reich crumbling into dust. The boys absorbed it with numb acceptance. It felt inevitable now, like watching a building burn that had been doomed from the moment the first match was struck. There was no surprise left, no shock, just the slow confirmation of what they'd known for months. On April 12th, President Roosevelt died. The radio announcement interrupted regular programming, and the ranch hands gathered around to listen, drawn by the gravity in the announcer's voice. When it ended, the Cowboys removed their hats, stood in respectful silence for a man who'd led them through depression and war, who'd been the only president some of them had ever really known. The German boys stood uncertain, not knowing the protocol. Was this their enemy who'd died? The man who'd led the nation fighting against Germany? Or just a man, a leader, someone deserving respect regardless of which side he'd been on? Rusty settled it by addressing them directly. "In America," he said, making sure they understood, "you can respect a leader even if you were once fighting against him, even if you opposed everything he stood for. Respect isn't about agreeing with everything someone did. It's about recognizing integrity and service, about acknowledging that someone tried to do right even if you think they did wrong." He paused, making sure they were following. Roosevelt kept this country together when it could have broken apart. He made hard choices, some right, some wrong, but he made them for reasons he believed in. That deserves respect regardless of which side you were on. The boys removed their hats, holding them awkwardly, not sure of the proper way to stand or how long to wait. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It meant understanding that the world was more complex than Berlin had taught them. That honor could exist on both sides of a conflict. That you could oppose someone's cause with everything you had and still acknowledge their humanity, their effort, their sacrifice. The lessons Texas was teaching went deeper than roping and riding. They went to the core of what it meant to be human in a world that kept insisting some humans were more human than others. May 8, 1945. The ranch gathered around the radio at 3 in the afternoon, drawn by word that something important was coming. The announcement came through static and crackling interference, the signal weak but clear enough to understand. "The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally to Allied forces. The fighting has stopped." Dietrich felt the words land like physical blows, each one hitting harder than the last. It was done. Everything they'd been raised to believe in, fight for, die for, finished, defeated, erased from history, except as a warning about what happens when you believe the wrong things. Beside him, Wolf stared at the radio with an expression of such profound loss that it hurt to witness, like watching someone's soul break in real time. Klaus closed his eyes and whispered something in German that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. It was hard to tell which. Around them, the Cowboys were quiet. No celebration, no cheering, no dancing in the streets. They'd won technically, but the cost had been too high for triumph. Everyone in this room had lost someone. Everyone bore scars, visible or otherwise. The boys sat in stunned silence, not knowing what to feel. Relief that the dying was finally over. Shame that their country had lost, that everything they'd been promised had turned out to be lies. Grief for everything that had been destroyed, all the death that couldn't be undone. Around them, the ranch continued. Cattle lowed in the distance. Wind moved through the mesquite. The sun tracked across the sky exactly as it had yesterday, as it would tomorrow. The world kept turning despite nations falling, despite everything they'd known ending. And somehow that was the cruelest part. that life just continued indifferent to their grief. Dietrich found tears on his face and wasn't sure what they were for. His father may be dead in Hamburg 2 years ago, or his mother who he hadn't heard from in 6 months and might never hear from again, or the simple waste of it all, the millions dead for a cause that had been rotten from the start, poisoned at its roots. "I need air," Wolf said suddenly and stumbled out of the room like he was choking.
Dietrich followed, and Klaus came after, and they stood outside under the Texas sky while their world ended 4,000 miles away, while everything they'd known turned to ash and memory. "It's over," Wolf said, voice breaking. "Everything we knew, everyone we were, our country, our families, our whole lives, just over." "We're still here," Klaus said, and there was something fierce in his voice despite his youth, despite the tears on his face. "Mother's gone. Berlin's burning. Germany's defeated. But we're still here, still breathing, still standing." Dietrich thought about that. Thought about the boys who'd arrived in July, terrified and half-starved, and believing in destiny and blood and the superiority of their race. Thought about who they'd become through months of honest work and patient teaching and the slow erosion of certainty. "Maybe that was the point all along," he said quietly. "Maybe we were never supposed to conquer anything. Maybe we were just supposed to learn how to live in the world, work with it instead of trying to dominate it, build instead of destroy." The other two looked at him, waiting. "They told us to conquer," Dietrich continued, the words coming easier now. "But Texas taught us how to ride, how to move with things instead of against them, how to be strong without being cruel. And maybe that's what matters. Maybe that's what we take forward." A shadow fell across them. Rusty had come outside, and he'd brought Samuel Hardwick with him. The ranch owner looked older than his 58 years, worn down by grief and work, and the weight of running a ranch during wartime while burying his sons. He looked at the 3 German boys, and they looked back, not sure what to expect, afraid of what he might say now that his country had won and theirs had lost. "The war's over," Samuel said finally, his voice rough, "which means you'll be processed for repatriation soon. "Sent back to Germany, what's left of it. Back to whatever homes still stand." The boys nodded. They'd known this was coming, had been expecting it for weeks. "Before you go," Samuel continued, and his voice was rougher now, emotion breaking through, "I want you to know something important. You didn't kill my sons. Your country did. Your leaders did. The men who started this war and fed you lies and sent children to fight did." He paused, gathering himself, forcing the words out. "You're just boys who got caught in it. Like my boys got caught in it. Like millions of boys on both sides got caught in something they didn't start and couldn't stop. And watching you work these past months, watching you learn, watching you become good hands, it's been the only thing that's made sense to me, the only thing that felt like building instead of breaking." He extended his hand to Dietrich, the gesture formal and significant. "Thank you for the work, and for saving Charlie, and for showing an old man that maybe there's still hope for the world, that maybe all this death wasn't completely meaningless if something good can come from it." Dietrich took his hand, throat too tight for words, and felt the firm grip of a man who'd chosen forgiveness over hatred despite having every reason to choose otherwise. Samuel shook hands with each of them. Wolf, Klaus, the others, then walked back inside, leaving them alone with Rusty. The old foreman looked at his boys because that's what they'd become. His boys, regardless of nationality or uniform, and something in his weathered face softened just slightly. "Orders will come through in the next week or so," he said. "Until then, we got work to do. Spring roundup's coming biggest of the year, and I'll need every hand I can get." It was permission to pretend just for a little while longer that this could last. That they could stay in this bubble where nationality didn't matter, and the only thing that counted was whether you could do the job. They took it gratefully, knowing it wouldn't last, but holding on to it anyway. The final week passed too quickly, days bleeding into each other with the speed that time always has when you know it's ending. The work continued, it always continued, but there was an edge to it now, a desperate quality as the boys tried to memorize everything. The smell of mesquite smoke on the morning air, the feel of rope against calloused palms, the texture of hemp worn smooth by use, the weight of a saddle settling onto a horse's back, that perfect balance point where it sat right. The vast Texas sky, and the way it made you feel both small and infinite at once, crushed by its immensity and expanded by its possibility. On May 10th, Samuel hosted a farewell dinner. He'd saved rations for months to make it happen, trading favors and pulling strings to get ingredients that were usually impossible to find during wartime. Steaks grilled over mesquite until they were charred on the outside and pink within. Beans cooked slow with bacon until they were almost candy sweet.
Fresh cornbread that steamed when you broke it open. Peach cobbler made from fruit preserved last summer. Dietrich cut into his steak and watched the juice run across the plate, and he tried to memorize the taste. The smoke embedded in every fiber of meat, years of mesquite fires leaving their mark. The salt that brought out the natural sweetness. The char that added depth and complexity. He thought about his mother in Hamburg, if she was even alive, eating whatever scraps could be found in a destroyed city. Thought about the guilt of being here, being fed like this, while his country starved and burned. But he also thought about what Rusty had said about honoring loss by becoming someone worth the survival. About building instead of destroying. About the patient work of becoming better than circumstances demanded. Wolf held a piece of cornbread butter melting into the golden crumb, and felt tears sting his eyes. This simple food, this abundance, had been the first crack in the propaganda, the first proof that everything Berlin taught was lies. American weakness producing bacon thick as thumbs. American degeneracy creating plenty, while the master race starved. Klaus ate his peach cobbler, slowly savouring the sweet tart fruit, the cinnamon, the buttery crust, and thought about his mother, who'd never taste anything again, who died believing in spring and gardens and futures that would never come. After dinner, Rusty stood. No grand speech, no dramatic pronouncements, just eye contact with each boy one by one. A firm handshake that said more than words ever could. And simple words, "You'll always have a place here if you come back. This will always be home if you need it." Charlie. His ankle long healed from the stampede, stepped forward too. He looked at Dietrich, and without words, pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace. His gait still favoured the leg slightly, a permanent reminder of the day an enemy saved his life. When he stepped back, his eyes were wet. "You saved my life," he said in halting German he'd been practicing for weeks. "I won't forget. Ever." Dietrich nodded, throat too tight to speak, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. That night, there was music one last time. Wolf played his harmonica, pouring everything he couldn't say into the notes. Dusty joined on guitar without hesitation, and the melodies intertwined like they'd been doing it for years instead of months. The stars wheeled overhead, infinite and ancient and indifferent, and for a few hours the war didn't exist. There was only the music and the fire and the knowledge that some things, the important things, transcended borders and uniforms and the madness of nations. May 11th, 1945. Morning. The same truck that had brought them 10 months ago rolled through the ranch gate, kicking up familiar dust. The boys packed their few belongings, letters, small keepsakes, memories more precious than gold. They changed back into the uniforms that hung loose on frames, now hardened by months of work, their bodies transformed by labor and food and the simple passage of time. Dietrich looked back at the ranch as they climbed into the truck, memorizing every detail with desperate intensity. The barn where Rusty had first taught him to lift a saddle properly, to use his legs instead of his back. The corral where he'd learned to rope, where he'd fallen and gotten back up and finally gotten it right. The bunkhouse where he'd laughed harder than any time in Germany, where he'd discovered that joy was still possible, even in the middle of war. Wolf played his harmonica one last time as the truck rolled forward, a slow, mournful melody that carried across the mesquite and sage that seemed to hang in the air long after they'd passed. The cowboys stood watching until the dust settled, and the sound faded into nothing but memory. They'd chosen humanity over hatred, had chosen to teach instead of punish, to build instead of break. And in doing so, they'd changed 17 lives in ways that would ripple forward through decades, touching people they'd never meet, creating echoes that would outlast them all. The truck disappeared over a rise, taking the boys toward whatever future awaited them, and Rusty turned back to the ranch, back to the work that never ended, the eternal cycle of seasons and cattle and land that demanded attention. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But something had changed. Some small victory had been won in the larger defeat of the war. Proof that even in the darkest times people could choose kindness over cruelty, could build bridges instead of walls, could see humanity in the enemy. It wouldn't bring back the dead, wouldn't undo the millions of tragedies the war had caused, the cities destroyed, the families shattered, the futures stolen. But it was something. A seed planted in scorched earth. A foundation laid for whatever would come next. And sometimes that was enough. March 2003. 60 years later. The Historical Society traced the harmonica to Wolfgang Richter through patient research and old letters. Discovered he'd died in 2001 in Dusseldorf, Germany, where he'd served as mayor from 1960 to 1984, known for practical governance and unusual kindness to refugees and immigrants. His will contained specific instructions. Mail the harmonica to Dietrich Albrecht, Austin, Texas, with the enclosed letter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded to an address that had been updated 3 times over the decades. Dietrich was 73 now, still lean and weathered like leather left in the sun, still moving with the economy of motion that 4 decades of ranch work had ingrained so deep it became part of his bones. He opened the package with hands that trembled slightly, age or emotion hard to say which. Pulled out the harmonica he remembered from 60 years ago, the metal tarnished but still solid. Unfolded the letter written in Wolf's familiar hand, shaky now, but still legible. Dietrich, 56 years since we left Mesquite Springs Ranch. I never forgot. I rebuilt Freiburg with American pragmatism and German efficiency. Became mayor, served for 24 years. Taught my children what Rusty taught us. Work hard, judge fairly. Build instead of breaking. But eating sauerbraten at Christmas, I'd remember Texas bacon that first morning when everything we'd been taught shattered with a single bite. Playing music for my grandchildren, I'd remember Dusty's guitar blending with this harmonica around fires under stars so big they seemed close enough to touch. You chose to return to America in '52, built a life there. I chose to rebuild Germany to make it better than what destroyed it. Klaus chose to stay and farm to be close to what remained of family. All correct choices. All honored what we learned in that Texas dust. The difference between conquering and riding that was everything. This harmonica crossed the Atlantic twice. First in my boot as a prisoner, hidden like a secret I was afraid they'd take. Now in a box to a brother because that's what you are. What we all were, those 17 boys who arrived terrified and left changed. I'm dying as I write this. Cancer eating through my lungs, doctor says weeks at most. But I'm not afraid. I'm grateful. Grateful I survived when so many didn't. Grateful for bacon and music and patient men who chose teaching over hatred. Grateful for understanding that the world is bigger and more complicated than any propaganda can capture. Play this sometimes. Remember we were boys who became cowboys, who learned that strength doesn't require cruelty, that the only thing separating good men from bad is whether they build or destroy, teach or break, choose kindness when hate would be easier. Rusty's been gone since '67, but his lessons live in us, in our children, in the small choices we make every day to be better than the world expects. That's the legacy, not conquest, not destiny, just the patient work of becoming men worthy of the second chance we were given. Your brother, in dust and memory. Wolf. Dietrich read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his weathered face, cutting tracks through skin darkened by decades of Texas sun. Then he picked up the harmonica and played a melody he hadn't touched in nearly 60 years. The same song Wolf had played that first night around the fire. The Rhine Valley folk tune that had blended impossibly with Dusty's Texas ballad, 2 traditions meeting and somehow making something new. His wife found him an hour later, still playing, still crying, still remembering boys and cowboys, and a summer when everything changed.